All right, so this time I'm going to try to do it just video instead of live because I'm up on a little bit of a foothill mountain here in the Shenandoah, and I doubt I could have a lot of receptivity. So yeah, so I'm here. This is my last day in Virginia. I'm sitting on the property of the Anglican Archdiocese, Episcopal Archdiocese of Virginia, and at the base of this little foothill is Shrine Mont and this sort of cathedral, open air cathedral of the Transfiguration, which I'll take a bit of a video when we get down there too. And I've got my little ladies down there, the little dolls, and a few acorns and things I've gathered along the way, some fungi, and I pulled out my flyers from last fall from I think it's Ella in Texas. The revolution will not be tokenized. Dandelion Manifest, Keepers of Natural Life. And I cut off the top of her dandelion picture and I put it in another installation down the way. So I wanted to leave this here under an old rock. These are Appalachian, super old mountains. As I was walking up, I love rocks. These rocks were not particularly exciting looking, but a lot of them are very white and very sort of old, like bones. So I think that's sort of the message there of time, old time and wisdom. So putting the message down there. And I think I'll start off, I have my little beauty tone bowl. Let's see if I can do it. And there's lots of cicadas around too, although not as much as at the insane asylum. So, and if I'm do like this, there's a lot of little buggies up here, but it's nature, right? So we've got to share. It's really their place. I'm invading on their place. Yeah, so I'm up on this beautiful mountain and there's dappled sunlight. There's blue skies with puffy clouds, and hopefully it's not going to rain on us. I know we're sort of approaching later afternoon. And, walked up this foothill. I'm not in the greatest shape, so it's like a lot of up. But then this pathway here is really nice and level, and there's really beautiful, I don't know if you can tell, but beautiful moss under these trees. So it's sort of the chunkiness of these old rocks and decaying wood and the moss, and it's all different kinds of moss, different varieties. And I know one of my inspirations, Robin Waldkimmer, the SUNY Forestry School professor, her specialty is moss. So I recommend looking at her book if you want to understand some more things about the world of mosses and how amazing and ancient and flexible and adaptable they are. We could probably learn a lot from the moss. She wrote a whole book about it. Yeah, so sitting on this moss, and so I came up this little trail. It's only about a mile up the little foothill from this Cathedral of the Transfiguration that's down at the bottom, and it's actually the Stations of the Cross along this hill up here. And when you get to the top, there's a tall observation deck, and maybe I'll film that. I didn't go up because there's someone else up there, and I didn't want to disrupt their experience. But just so like we're situated, I grew up, I feel like I'm sort of a bridge across faiths. If anything, I feel like a bit more in the mystic tradition than an institutional faith tradition. But I grew up, WASPy. We went to Presbyterian church for a while and then kind of fell away. And then when I was in high school, I went to a Methodist church for a bit because there was a fun youth group and there were some cute boys. And so that's sort of my religious background. And I can remember I was just talking with my friend the other day who has, she grew up in a missionary family, so a much more intensive faith practice. And, I was just talking about, I remember going to church in this Presbyterian church in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was a beautiful church. They had a new church and an old church, and I really loved the old church. But I always kind of chafed a bit at the original sin part, like as a kid, and the tone was always sort of how terrible we were. And, that's hard, hard for kids to assume everything is terrible, because kids are optimists, a lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of kids tend to look on the optimistic side of things, and sort of grappling with that. And actually, it's funny. Oh, sorry about that. My first token economy, I think, was in church for choir. I think they paid kids in candy to behave. So that was interesting. That's an interesting memory. Yeah, but just thinking about like our situation and, you know, this particular place, it's a very old mountain, old settlement of original people along the Stony Creek, and these springs, mineral springs, iron springs, and the Soneto people were the original people of these lands, like I think pre-woodland culture, and then they disappeared. And then later other tribal peoples were here, and then that was later displaced in pretty short order after colonization. And you know what's interesting, one of the things I like to talk about in terms of just situating in our understanding of history and the history that we're not taught. Let me make sure this is filming. Yeah. Something I came across, and I mentioned it in the VMI interview in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book Loaded, was about this, and actually it might have been an Indigenous people's history of the United States, actually, now that I think about it. But she spoke about the nature of the American Revolution, and that a lot of the taxation without representation, the taxes that were being asserted, like the stamp tax on printed materials and newspapers, the proceeds of that were actually to pay for the billeting of soldiers up and down the Appalachian Mountains. And so after the French and Indian War, where the British fought the French and the Indians, and that the truce was settled, the French had better relationships with the indigenous people than the British, because the French were really about trading, the fur trade, and the British were about land. And not that the original people saw land ownership in the same way that the British did, but it was the British wanted to, you know, take claim of the resources of the land that were the basis of sustenance for the original people. And the British had fought this long war, and they were busy building empire other places. And at one point, they drew this line that is essentially along sort of the backbone of the Appalachians. And here in Virginia, it was sort of along the West Virginia line, which we're very close to here. If I was more motivated, I could walk another 2 miles up the mountain and we'd be close to the West Virginia border, and that would probably be more accurate as far as this line. But it was called the Proclamation of 1763. And the British drew that line, and they told the colonists that they really, on the western side, that was for the indigenous people, and then on the other side, they were supposed to stay on the other side. And that served the British interests in two ways. The first aspect was they were interested in controlling the colonists and their commercial enterprises, so they weren't really interested in everyone spreading out over all this land and maybe becoming more self-sufficient. They wanted to control, have the colonists more under their control through transatlantic trade. And they could do that by containing them more into the existing footprint. And then also they were kind of interested in trying to establish maybe a better business relationship with indigenous people. So they set up these fortifications, and they thought maybe they could have some trading posts like the French. I don't know that necessarily worked out. But they needed lots of soldiers along this line to keep the settlers from going over, because they kept going over. And, you know, among those people were, you know, at least two of the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And the forests all around here are called the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson National Forests. And they're sort of on either side of this community of Bayse, Virginia, Orkney Springs, where I'm at. So we're sort of surrounded by the founding father, the national forest named after these founding fathers. But they were fundamentally land speculators. And they were interested in developing real estate. I think the Ohio company, George Washington, was very connected. Okay, so to be continued. I was running out of storage on my phone. Okay, so the Proclamation of 1763. The British said, don't go over on that side. The colonists kept sneaking over on that side. The British paid for a bunch of soldiers to be stationed along the border. And they were pretty good at keeping organized real estate developers out, but they were not so good at individual people sneaking across. And so it was sort of a leaky barrier across this Appalachian, and we're right here along that trail. And, you know, I was mentioning George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, that George Washington was part of something called the Ohio Company. And I think they had been settling Ohio, and then the French and Indian War came, and they got pushed back. And then, a lot of people who had made sort of investments, or this idea that had aspirations that they were going to develop land in the Ohio territories, were very upset with this law. And in fact, some of them were saying that they needed to develop the land on the other side of the Appalachians in order to pay back some of the debts that had been incurred during the French and Indian War. So when you understand that dynamic, and again, I'm not saying that the British were necessarily acting on behalf of the indigenous people there. The British were acting out of their own political interests, which was they wanted to contain their colonies so that they could be better managed and domesticated, like fencing, right? You had good fencing. That was supposed to be the idea, so that they could go over and pursue other aspects of empire in other regions during the late 18th, early 19th century. And so that's a very different angle on the Revolutionary War and, taxation with representation. If you imagine that a lot of the pressure was real estate speculation on lands that weren't actually technically entitled. Now, again, even the lands on the east weren't technically entitled. Like, we came here, this was a domination sort of system, and we came and we settled, and that's part of the Jamestown, which, the Episcopal Archdiocese here goes back to 1607, the Jamestown colony. So none of it, like, technically from the standpoint of the original people, was legitimate. But even so, under that, this was even less legitimate, because the people who were in charge, the British at the time, said, don't cross the line. And that's a piece of history I never got. I never knew that till I was probably like 48 years old. And it gives you just a different lens to think. And again, just the layers of history on these really old mountains, these old stone mountains, Jason and Cliff and I, we were out west, and seeing in the spring, I guess, in Utah, and those were different kinds of mountains, different kinds of rock formations. These are more gentled, actually, maybe civilized. Maybe if you imagine it as a civilizing process, sort of worn down and eroded. So anyway, so that's the situation on the Proclamation of 1763, which I wanted to say somewhere in the area of being near this line. I won't say I'm actually on it, but I'm probably within 5 miles of it here. Something to consider in terms of the colonial framework. And then also just to hit upon my religious upbringing, right? And WASP, Protestant, not super practicing, but realizing increasingly over the past couple of years how intentional the marginalization of people of faith has been for decades, probably really since after the Second World War in a really intense way. And the replacement of science for religion, that now science is the new religion. And that I think in many ways, not just Christians, but others, people of faith have been framed as othered, and people who might be dangerous, right? People who might be terrorists, people who might be racist, people who might be, and people who, it feels like there's lots of labels that have been put on people of faith practices across the board to make the idea of having sort of a sacred practice perceived of as something in popular culture, at least, that you shouldn't be proud of, or that you should be maybe a little embarrassed about, or something that's not that intellectual. And sort of grasping with the material versus the ephemeral, the sacred, the profane, the control system. I mean, I think in order for science to prevail, for this crazy crystallography, brain in a box, frequency conception of life to progress, they have to convince us to give away all the sacred, however you imagine the sacred, your sacred practice. And they've been doing a pretty good job. Yeah, because even a lot of the institutions of faith, the past 2 years have been really central. And I think they knew that, and I think the institutions have been brought along, many of them. Even alternative institutions. into the realm of science, that is science, and that the perception that through our instrumentation, through our electron microscopes and our models, that we can know all of the things. But I think the walk up, these stations of the cross, and just, I brought my basket with me. I've emptied it mostly. But on the way down, I'm going to collect some things, and on my way home, I'm going to make some stops along the Beltway. I'm hoping to stop at Capital One Center, which is sort of a smart city remake, and the Washington Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is just a stone's throw from the Howard Hughes Memorial Institute and the National Institutes of Health, and then maybe Columbia or Greenbelt, Maryland, sort of these other planned communities. So I have some stops. So I have to restore my natural materials, and but it's just sort of taking it in on the way up, and also stopping to take a breath every now and then. And it's, I don't know all the trees, but lots of oaks, lots of maples, lots of poplar, some dogwoods, and, the trees all around in the decay and the moss, and, reading these stations, thinking about it, thinking about this idea of, in the case of the Christian faith, Jesus, an individual taking on the weight of sort of massive levels of sin, and transmuting that, right? Like creating grace for other people. And I think, however you imagine Christianity, it's interesting to think about like this fight for numbers, right? That's part of the things that, people keep wagging their fingers at me. Not that I'm making any sort of correlation there, but just, we need numbers. And I don't know, like maybe it isn't numbers. Maybe it is, maybe in the realms of the sacred, it's not about numbers. It's about individual willingness to make those sacrifices. And even on the stations, because I know they exist, but I hadn't actually familiarized myself with all of them. But hitting me the loss of mothers, like the mother's loss, the wailing women, and saying we need to think about what we've done, right? And sort of for me, thinking about all of these, what I've come to understand about the domination principle, the engineering principle, the systems principle, the desecration of the natural world in favor of a mechanical world. It really hit me, just reading, because, even if that's not your thing, like the stories are there, the stories are on the land, and, it's up a hill. So you're grateful to sort of have a chance to pause and catch your breath and read, and hope that there's somebody that's got our back, right? Hope that God, the creator, the creatrix, has our back, because this feels big. This feels like a really, both big, but when you're sitting alone, mostly alone, except for a couple joggers on the top of a mountain with some dolls, it seems doable. It seems not so scary, but sometimes when you're down at the bottom of the mountain, it does seem scary. So, anyway, just little things I learned, things I saw looking on the way up. I saw beautiful fungus. I saw several funguses. Some of them were more beautiful than others, but there was one that was cupped under like leaf litter. So it was like a little cave kind of, and it was sort of speckled white, not very big, like maybe a little bigger than a golf ball, the cap, and it was sort of rounded and very white. And so it was almost made its own little cave, which is interesting because there's a lot of caves here. And, I've talked written in the past somewhat about like communication and these communication networks. And, I mentioned it, the Orson Scott Card about the phyllotes and the entanglements and the mycelium and the wood wide web, and how all of these cognitive neurosciences really want to figure out how that stuff works so they can try to parody it. And it made me happy, and it also made me a little wistful, because I've had some mixed lines of communication lately that have hurt my heart. But I guess that's part of being human, right? And so just a reminder, like the natural communication is the best kind of communication. Although for the kind of thing I'm doing right now, I guess this has to suffice. And then we got up, and so right after the Jesus dies on the cross, there was a bit of a clearing, and it was the first section that really, it was opened up, and it had moss, this beautiful moss. And again, I've mentioned a couple times that this mossy moss color is the sort of antidote to the magenta that my friend Steffers talks about, this magenta, which is sort of a contrived color that's off of the color spectrum and that's being used. I mean, there seems to be indications that it may be being used in an encoding sort of way to insert this new reality into our existing reality. And so it's really nice to be surrounded by all of this moss, all of this green. And so you see, that Jesus dies on the cross, which is really sad, and then you sort of have this opening, and within the moss in this particular space were all of these acorns, and lots of different kinds of acorns. Like there's ones that have flat caps and ones that have rounder caps, and like here's a flat one, and then there's ones with the acorns are still green, all different kinds, and they still have the acorns in them, which is nice. I think later in the season the squirrels get their fill and then they're gone. It's just when you see that, and then moving towards the resurrection, these acorns, these oaks, right? From tiny things, amazing things grow and come. And a lot of what I've been learning about cycles and periodicity and frequency, it's waves. Like some waves are long and some are short. But there are cycles, and so we may be in the part of the cycle where we're just planting the seeds, or we're just holding, I don't know, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about shiitake and tinder fungus, which this isn't. I think this is it's a little kind of pink. But holding, the tinder fungus was what carried the spark, and you carried it on over, for them, they were being pushed out of their lands, right, of upstate New York into the lake region. She was citizen Potawatomi Nation. And yeah, so maybe we're the acorn planters, and maybe we're the spark carriers. And we don't know. We don't know how it goes. I had a lovely thing happen to me this last couple days. A friend who did a lovely artwork, the Dandelion Manifest artwork that we put up on my blog, which is available as like a PDF. Someone had printed it, and they were actually part of an academic institution that would have an interest in all of the things that are happening. Hard to say which side of the coin they're on, but this particular person must have gotten it because they actually put it on their door. So somehow this image of the revolution will not be tokenized, that was one of them, was printed out with the dandelions, went from upstate New York to the cloud, to my blog, over across to England. And this person actually has connections to the University of East Anglia, where the first environmental climate change science center was, but I think it's going to be the radio ecology, blockchain kind of ecology, not legit, not indigenous kind. So it's interesting to see the cycles. You don't know. You plant things and you don't know where they're going to turn up. And then I got to the very top. It got very rocky at the end between the entombment and the cross, which is up on this large tower, and I can show it to you in a bit. But I made a cross from materials, so down by the shrine. It's very interesting to me, given that the baptismal font of this shrine, Mont Episcopal shrine, is a corn grinding bowl of indigenous people. And the planters that are in front of the altar are these kind of sad white begonias, and they're interspersed with sort of this beautiful variegated yucca. Now, yucca isn't like a native to Virginia, but it's interesting to me to see the yucca there with the corn grinding bowl, because the Mayan people are the people of the corn, where their cosmology is that they are created out of the corn, the sacred corn. So I clipped off 2 pieces of the yucca, and I brought it up, and I found some sassafras, which is medicinal, and I found another little lovely leaf that's a heart leaf, and some flower petals that I've saved, dried from my summer farmer's market bouquets. And that's where I put the dandelion manifest drawing that I think it was Ella did for us, and a big sunflower in the middle that had been dried from a bouquet, and a lot of acorns, 6 acorns or so, and a bit of sage, because I feel like this is all syncretic. I mean, it's layers, right? It's the Senedo, it's the woodland people, it's the land speculators, it's the Anglicans, it's tourists, there's people like me, there's people who are all just trying to figure it out, and find the way to be good people, and often knowing that the story that they tell us how to be good people often serves existing systems of power, which is complicated, because there's no handbook exactly on how to be the good person. So before we go back to the tower, I guess I'll walk up and show you what the tower looks like. I did bring, my friend in Seattle had sent me this, and I've held on to it for a long time. I did tear one of the pages out in the front, and I left it at the Insane Asylum Sterilization Center in Stanton. But it's We Are Power by John Trudell. I've read it from in other settings, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read a couple paragraphs just to situate us and to sort of put this imprint on the space. Because I do think the idea of civilization and domestication are the things that we're struggling with. And the next phase of civilizing will be that nanotech, augmentation of bodies. I was just talking with Jason this morning, and he was doing some research into this Bina 48 robot thing, and these biotech companies that are working on sort of artificial organs or transgenic, like animal people organs and things. And Bernal was, that's what he's imagining, that we would put our brain in a cylinder and attach random blood circulating things through it. And they would call that civilized. But to me, the idea of periodicity, the idea of you have a life, you live, perhaps you suffer, you have some beautiful things happen, and then your time is done, and then you die, and then you go back into the universe. And that's a regenerative cycle, right? That's the cycle of the little fungi on the path. People give themselves to the world, and then that's the cycle. If we all hung around as brain in boxes forever, we'd be crowded with a bunch of messy fluid, I guess, probably leaking all the time. We should have our time. We should try to use our time well and do that. But that to me feels like the civilizing process. And to be in the natural cycle is the antithesis of that. And how to hold on to that in a world of technology and economic brutality and confusion, mental confusion. I don't have any easy answers. I have a lot of things I wonder about. So anyway, here's John Trudell, a couple paragraphs about nature, because I can imagine the idea of having your brain in a box would be like perpetual purgatory. It would be like, or hell, really, like to have your brain trapped in a box, bathed in fluid, thinking thoughts that maybe aren't even your own thoughts, and being forced to participate with collective consciousnesses that you don't want to be. I mean, to me, that's either purgatory or hell. And so we really have to think very carefully about the world that we're building around us, because those of us who are adults, we're only going to see the tip of it, but it's the children in the natural world that are going to suffer if we don't get clear. So, okay. We must not become confused. We must not become confused and deceived by their illusions. There is no such thing as military power. There is only military terrorism. And there is no such thing as economic power. There is only the economic within these illusions, so we will believe that they hold power in their hands, but they do not. All they know how to do is act in a repressive, brutal way. And I just want to say a shout out to the people in my life who are a lot, that are in these in-between spaces. And They don't have a stable home. They don't have a stable income, not for any lack of talent or commitment or dedication, but simply because the structure has been built that way. And yeah, so I see you. And that's why we have to figure this out. We have to figure this out soon. The power. We are a natural part of the earth. We are an extension of the earth. We are not separate from it. We are part of it. The earth is our mother. The earth is a spirit, and we are an extension of that spirit. We are spirit. We are power. They want us to believe that we have to believe in them, that we have to assume these consumer identities and these political identities and these religious identities and these racial identities. They want to separate us from our power. They want to separate us from who we are. Genocide. And I think he's speaking particularly to the indigenous people who had gathered for a conference. But I think, again, I keep saying those lessons we need to learn because they're going to be applied more broadly and to the natural world. Genocide is just an intellectual way of saying murder because we live in a so-called civilized, industrialized world. And because this world is allegedly civilized and allegedly has laws, they can't go out and call it an act of murder anymore. They call it genocide to throw another illusion in our eyes. And they have limited our ability to see the necessity for our survival because they want us to believe that genocide just means physical extinction. We must consider the spiritual genocide that they commit against us, the spiritual genocide that of white people have been victimized for thousands of years, the spiritual genocide that told them not to respect the earth, the spiritual genocide that told them not to respect the life that is earth, but to pay all their tribute through the churches and God in heaven, and that heaven would take care of them in the afterlife. And they tried to take and suppress our natural identity, our natural spiritual connection to the earth. I think that's an important lesson. We must move to the time when we truly understand our connection to real power, because these people who deal with illusions and imitations, these men who have attempted to improve upon nature, they want to keep us confused. They want to keep us confused with sexism and ageism, racism and class. And they want to keep us in confusion so that we will continue to believe in one lie after another as they program them into our minds and into our society. Power. They can't stop the wind, and they can't stop the rain, and they can't stop the earthquake and the volcano and the tornado. They can't stop power. We are a spiritual connection to the earth. As individuals, we have power, and collectively, we have the same power as the earthquake, the tornado, and the hurricanes. We have that potential. We have that connection. So I think, again, the power, nature, connection, the sacred, looking very clearly with very clear eyes about the institutions that surround us and what their actual intentions are, and the way in which we kid ourselves about what they are and how it manifests. These are all things to think about. And so I guess that's all I've got to say sitting here on this old mountain. I was listening to the cicadas. The cicadas are a symbol of transformation because of their metamorphosis. And as I was laying out the little cross thing and the sunflower and a big swallowtail butterfly like flew in, metamorphosis. And as I was walking along, there's all of these rocks, and there's one that kind of, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, and it was a tiny little toad, tiny, like this big, just sitting there. He's just sitting there. So we need to be good relatives, folks, and being good relatives means not submitting to the domination of biotechnology and living in right relationship to the earth, and not looking to the people who made all the problems to fix them, because they're not going to fix them the right way. They're going to give you blockchain and nanotechnology tags and systems engineering. And I guess lastly, so we made these little dolls. I think I showed them to you yesterday. And I forgot to mention, we were at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and they were dropping off I guess they actually call them rats. The incoming class are called rats. Tells you something. And there was a plaque on a monument somewhere, and my friend had stopped to look at it, and another family was like, oh, well, now we have to look at it too. So they were all stopping, and it was young people and parents, and there was a little girl. She was maybe 8, and she saw my basket, and she saw the dolls, and she's like, oh, what are those? And I said, oh yeah, we made them. And she goes, you made them? And I said, yeah, we made them. And she said, oh, I've never made anything. And she was just very wistful. I mean, not in a sad way. She was just charming. And so I gave her a little piece of mica, which is wonderful, this clear stone. It's kind of the last of my mica. And I was like, here, this is cool. You can take that. And, she went off with her family. But I keep thinking, we need to get back in touch. We need to find ways to get back in touch with our hands, with real materials. We need to make food. We need to grow food. We need to sing songs. We need to play instruments. We need to write poetry. We need to write books. We need to read books. We need to make theater. We need to do all of this in the real and not in the virtual. And I know I probably sound like a hypocrite for saying this on video. But anyway, thanks for listening. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a stroll. We'll go take a look at the cross thing, and then I'm going to show you around the shrine at the end. All right, well, we're up on the platform. The sun is shining pretty bright. You can see there's the cross, and you've got the view over the valley. Out that way it's a bit glary because of the sun, but at least we're not having rain. It's very lush. My friend told me that it's been really rainy here this August, so everything is really green and alive and beautiful. And you can see in the distance, I think that's towards West Virginia, the blue of the Blue Ridge. And yeah, it's quite the view. I guess one thing I'll say while I'm up here too is, I talked a little bit yesterday at the Woodrow Wilson Library about homeostasis and peace, the League of Nations, international arbitration, and the Quakers and the peace movement. And it's it's hard to forget when you're in the Shenandoah Valley how much of even daily life still echoes the Civil War, and the Confederacy and the battles that happened and all the blood that was shed here in these valleys, in the valley and on the hills around here. And, that sacrifice, these sacrifices made, and I would never want to be a person who stood against peace. I mean, nobody wants to be that. But I think we have to understand about also free will, and that if our evolution as humans into something better is coercive and happens just through technology or through token transfers and sensor networks, if that's the sort of the creative power of the universe, God, what have you, if we're put here to go through trials and experience things and learn, if the lessons are short-circuited by technology because we've had nudges, or we've had programmed money, or we've had, all of that sort of thing, does it count? Does it count, right? And so if we have these crutches that, if we have our smartwatches and we have our, time online and all of these things, is that part of our humanity? Does it count as free will, that we've freely chosen to try to be better, whether that's better kinder, more charitable, healthier, fitter. These are the things I think about. And if the idea of us being here is maybe to experience life and learn lessons, including conflict resolution, if we end up in this homeostasis, this engineered thing, and it's not our free will, and maybe we don't even know it, but we've been turned into sort of, what do they call it, non-playable characters in this game of life, or neutered, right? Like our emotions are neutered, dampened down, amplified. I mean, I know some people probably think I'm too much. Sometimes my family thinks I'm too much. Sometimes people I thought were my friends think I'm too much. But that's part of the lesson. If I became not me through some sort of wearable technology or integrated technology or frequency system, just to be like this, like that wouldn't actually be me. And then am I fulfilling my purpose here on the earth in this time? And if you do good things because you have to, not because you want to, does that count? I've been reading this book about Quakernomics and all of the Quakers' role in both industry and social justice causes going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And I just think about agency and co-optation, and clearly we don't want people to die or starve or be in the exposed elements or be suffering from illness. But we need to talk about free will and technology and goodness and civil society. When we need to talk about it soon, because the blockchain tokens are coming, the blockchain tokenomics. So anyway, here's this beautiful view. I guess it gives you some perspective of being up, in the trees amongst the oaks, lots of different kinds of oaks up here. And I love that because like oaks feel solid, they feel like they're going to be around for a long time. It gives you a good perspective across time and space and history. And thinking about Shenandoah Valley and war and peace and technology and goodness. And does goodness count if it's programmed and maybe you don't even understand how it happened? Okay, so you can see up there, that's where we were just now. That was the cross up on the platform. We came down, and then people have left. It looks like people have left stones who made the walk up. And then this is what I prepared. I did a little cross, and then we have Ella's dandelion picture with, I don't know if you guys can see. Let me see. There's the dandelions and the bees, the happy bees, and the sun, and that's the yucca, and you can see the oak acorns, and there's some sassafras underneath, the tripartite sassafras and the dandelion leaves. And then this is a bit of sage that someone sent to me, and I felt like that was very fitting because, again, this is all built up on the land of the Senedo and other original peoples here. And I love how the sage is sort of spiraling because I think life is like a spiral. So, and you can see the sunflower in the middle. So that was the gesture left here. There's some, little potpourri of flowers from our farmer's market. And you can't quite see it. Maybe we can walk. I'll walk a bit along this way. So this is the path you can see, and then right before you get up to this spot, there's a rocky bit. And one of the things I was thinking as I was walking along the path before, so see, this is there's one of the stations here, Stations of the Cross. 14 is being placed in the tomb, and they have these very simple drawings, but you can sort of picture the wrapping of the body in the cloth, awaiting the resurrection. That does evoke sort of a metamorphosis process, but definitely not a mechanical one, not a hive mind consciousness one. And then we've got, just want to show you some of the rocks. It's very quiet here. There's only been 2 other people on the path so far, which is lovely. It's been about a mile. It gives you a sense of what it's like to be in these woods. It's a pretty open underbrush. There's rhododendron and some mountain laurel. There's the understory and some white pines. But you're not getting this in a video game. Niantic can't patent this stuff. A brain in a cylinder with crustacean micromotors is not going to do it. And even so, there's times when you have an old aging body that it's like, oh my gosh, you feel your body, but that's the whole part, right? That's the periodicity. You live in a fragile baby body and then a robust, rambunctious toddler body and, a hormonal teenage body and a strong adult body, and then you sort of work your way around the other end of the continuum, and that's life. That's how it should be, because you get to experience all the different parts. So you can see the walk up to the tomb, and I'm sure that they did that on purpose. And I'm just going to walk the rest of the way down, and I can show you the little mossy bit where all the acorns were, and you can appreciate maybe it's sort of a rounded circle, so the anti-cybernetics. Little steps coming down. So, yeah. So the one down the hill is Jesus dying on the cross, and then you come up and then you just are treated to this beautiful moss in the dappled sunlight. You can see all the oak leaves, and then just look at that color. It's spectacular. It's just, look at the little baby fungus, right? Look at these guys, all the communication. That's what I was trying to convey in my last blog post. All this communication going all around us. The sky, the sun, the clouds, the trees, the fungi, the moss. And we can only really appreciate the smallest part of it, and even so, amazing gratitude for this day. This is a stand-up pokeweed on the trail down the bottom. We're going down, easier going down than up, and it's just in all the stages of development. And the pokeweed is it's actually poisonous, but if you boil it and change out the water, you can eat the greens. I guess you would saute them, and the berries are used by the Amish and maybe the Mennonite as a dye for fabric when you see the purple dye. And I just think this is just like the beauty of nature, right? The beauty of, and it's a weed, right? They call it a weed, but it's got its own stuff going on. And I was just saying, like, I went to school in the 80s, and pink and green were like the preppy colors. Not that I wore a lot of pink and green, but these flowers always remind me of that. And again, just putting in context, nature, abundance, right? If you have the knowledge to use it appropriately, and just a feast for the eyes, and something that maybe others would consider a weed, but I don't. I always liked poke. Okay, so I made it down the little hill. We came down the trail, and this is right before the open air Cathedral of the Transfiguration, and it's a labyrinth. And so you can see behind me is the mosaic version of the labyrinth. It's meant for meditation. And apologize for there's a lot of bugs down here. It's a little moist. We're at the bottom of this hill, and there's a lot of springs, so it's a bit muddy and buggy. But so the labyrinth is made out of native stone here, and there's an open area in the middle where people place offerings. So you can see it behind me, the labyrinth. And I walked it the first day that we got here, and it was even muddier. And but it was nice, and then just walked it today because I felt like it would be a good closure on our trip. And the idea is that you sort of have an intention, a meditation, and you keep that in your mind as you walk into the middle, and then you sort of contemplate for a bit in the middle, and then you walk your way back out, and it sort of touches on the 4 quadrants. And, as I've talked about in the past a bit, it feels like some of this predator energy is a bit related to like the Minotaur and Wall Street and Mithraic mythology. And so the labyrinth is an interesting thing to sort of walk and then make it your way back out. And I didn't need a thread, for no Ariadne required to make it out today. And so just to let people know, like the intention I set the first time, part of it, because I've been really thinking about this a lot, it's been weighing on my mind, the idea of how do we build community, meaningful community, and also letting go of the outcomes of the work. Again, not to deny responsibility for it, but to try to, that's one of my personal struggles is, I'm still kind of, I was raised as the achiever, and that's a lesson that I need to learn, is to sort of separate from that. So the idea of separating myself from the outcomes of the actions that we're doing, and thinking about catalyzing the creation of some kind of community and how that works, even though things are really challenging and messy right now, especially with people being under so much stress. And that relates a little bit to the intention that I set today, because my friend Cliff, early on in the lockdowns, he sort of gave me sort of a way of thinking about things. And one of the phrases was life, health, happiness, and open paths. And I had never really heard of the idea of open paths. And I think on the one hand, you might say, oh, this is sort of cybernetics, like a circle and a circuit and whatever. But for me at the time, I hadn't started really studying cybernetics. And my visualization was that I had spent some time the summer of 2020 out in South Dakota and near the Moro River and this beautiful rolling countryside. And river valley and beautiful big sky and prairie and wildflowers. And some people that we had met there, they were in the process of trying to gentle these 3 young horses, and maybe break, maybe gentle, but they needed to get used to people and get used to saddles and get used to walking around on a lead. And I'm not a horse person at all. I was willing to give it a shot and be part of the team to try to do that. And they were a bit of a handful, and so some days were trickier than others, and some days I sort of scooched out from outside the corral, and I would head out the back little dirt track up to the pasture, the raised pasture above the corral area. And for me, that seems like kind of a symbol of, right, the civilization, the corralling, the breaking, the gentling to the social structure, to utility, right? And then the path away from that. And the path away from that was what I imagined as an open path, which was, again, this dirt road that went up the hill and just into this amazing sea of grass and big sky and wildflowers and, And it's interesting because even that path had 2 divergences. I think one you could use, it was steeper, and if it wasn't muddy, you could use the steep path, and one was gentler, but they were open. And so I think this idea of open paths, this idea that we can, in an optimal world, we could fulfill our gifts and learn our lessons and develop our relationships and, it's still working good. Do all of these amazing things, but again, so many people are experiencing crises, right, and limited opportunity and challenges, financial challenges, emotional challenges, social challenges. And so today, when I walked into the labyrinth, like my intention was that for the people in my sphere that are struggling like this, just to know that you're in my heart, I'm thinking about you. I don't know how to fix it all, but I can try to project at least that you're cared about, and and I'm putting this out to the world, to the Creator, that hopefully we can get some things set right. And it was for open paths and good outcomes, and that goes for everybody. Everybody in my circle who's struggling right now, and so that's what I did. And I took a little sprig of cedar. I had sort of a little cedar to sort of worry on the way in. And if you're looking for a good book recommendation, Lee Marical, I think she died last year, but she was a very well-regarded and wonderful Indigenous poet from what's now, the British Columbia, Vancouver area. And she one of her books is called Celia Song, and I actually read it that summer when I was with the horses and on the open paths and in the meadows and growing moss in a cedar box. And the book Celia's Song, it touches on sort of the struggles of the indigenous life in the Pacific Northwest and the role of cedar in their lives culturally, from birth and cradleboard to grave, and like death, you know, their casket, all cedar, that cedar takes care of you. And in that story, there was a family that had lived through a lot of trauma, and one of the things they talked about was dropping a sprig of cedar on a really, really hot iron skillet, and it would sort of sizzle, and the smell that was sort of like sage, that was a cleansing. So I had my sprig of sage, and I was just wishing for folks open paths and good outcomes. You know, whether we're on the same page right now or not, we all deserve the chance to use our gifts and to be fulfilled, and that's what we're here to do. So anyway, there's the Labyrinth. That's my story of the Labyrinth. And now, just to close off, we'll go down to the open air shrine. Okay, so we've come down from the Labyrinth on a little road. This is the first station of the cross stop, and then this is the area with the shrine. And you can see it's quite charming. Got a little covered area. And then there's probably not going to be a lot of light in here, but this is the interior chapel. And it's very nice because it's all screened in. As we know, there's lots of bugs. So I did want to show you here when I came in the other day. Sorry. A little bit askew. This is I think you hear the pump for the fountain there. So this is the stained glass, and it says Diocese of Virginia, 1607 to 1785. And it has 3 ships and a cross and crossed swords and 3 keys. And underneath it says Confitemini Domino. So 1607 is Jamestown. That was the first Anglican, the first Anglicans in Virginia. It was the state religion until 1785. And then here's a little stained glass window, and I can't read the Latin there. The attribute is a church, so I should probably look that up to see which saint's attribute is the church. I don't know if that's Peter. I guess I'm showing my ignorance on that. But so this is the indoor sort of rustic chapel. And what you can hear next to me maybe is there's a pump on this little pond. So you've got cattails. There are lovely, lovely cattails here, and a little bridge. So again, very charming little bridge that goes over, and you've got the pump and rhododendrons, I'm sure in season. This is quite glorious. And then you've got the bell tower. This is all local stone, either brought by horse or rolled by individuals and carried here. So you've got this is the back of the altar and the bell tower going up. And this was built in 1925, I believe. You've got a lot of ivy. And what you can do is you can see there are many inscriptions. And I don't know if that's many inscriptions here. A lot of them connected to the Gibson family, and then the Mumma family, and others. Tyndall, Dennis, Mumma. And you've got boxwood. So box is very, very English, of course. And again, I will read. This is the it's actually a burial. Edmund Lee Woodward, Master's MD and I guess Doctorate of Divinity, 1873 to 1948. And he was a missionary in China, sorry about that, from 1899 to 1914. And then a rector and dean of Virginia Church Schools, and founder and director of Shrine Mont. So this is his concept, and his wife Frances Gibson Woodward. So there's the Woodwards and the Gibsons, and again, Mummas and Gibsons are very central. So just so you can see, so it's all open. you've got the bench seating, and then you've got the niche for the piano, and then the altar, and then the bell tower. And then in front here, I've mentioned there's the benches. I don't know if that's for the choir. And then you've got the begonias and the yucca plant. So right behind me, right there, that is the baptismal font next to the altar. And I've mentioned this a couple times, but it is, according to tradition, a corn grinding bowl of the indigenous people. So it's very interesting to me that, again, you've got the bell tower right there, and sort of in very close alignment, the baptismal font with this indigenous corn grinding bowl. It's quite sizable. It's about 3 feet across. I'm sure it's pretty weighty. It's almost just like a boulder. And in a second, I'll turn it around so you can see. Well, maybe you can see it. Can you see it that way? Oh yeah. So yeah, you can see how that works. And I feel again that it's very significant because corn is one of the primary beings, right? That's being managed through genetic modification. We know that Latin America plays a major role, I think, in the construction of the metaverse. A lot of these coding boot camps and finclusion and digital programmable money are going to be linked to the conditional cash transfer pilots that were in Mexico. And one of the first ecological impact bonds tied to the coral reef and storms on coral reefs, this parametric insurance that we're going to talk about a little bit later, that's right off of Veracruz in Mexico. So I think Mexico and Latin America and the New World are really central, and corn is really central, and tobacco is central. So the corn, the co-optation of this piece of stone, this artifact, into sort of the bell tower there. As you know, I've talked often about Stephen Newcomb's assessment of the dome, the bells being the dome of domination. And actually, right when I was walking the labyrinth, the dinner bell rang, so I don't know what that means. But that's sort of the layout here. So I'm going to flip around and look at the altar. Okay, so you can see here, this, I think what's undercover there is like a piano or a little organ. You've got the baptismal font. It's a little step up, and then you've got, it was full of water the first day I was here, and then you've got the altar, or I guess where you do the readings, the pulpit, and then a secondary one, maybe holding music, and then you've got the cross and the altar. The flowers were fresh when we got here, but they're looking a little puny now. And it's interesting, I would say, of all of these memorial plaques, this one with Lancelot, Minor Blackford, is particularly interesting to me. I'm curious to look up Lancelot and see his situation. So I talked about this a little bit when we were at the Stanton Abandoned Insane Asylum, and I was trying to give the trajectory of our whole day, and my friend said, Allison, you tried to fit too much into one thing, so maybe it bears repeating today. So the 1607, the establishment of the Church of England as the state religion of Virginia colony at that time, it was the state religion to 1789. Jamestown was, there was the Roanoke that disappeared, but sort of the first imprinting of, the colonial structure. It was done with intention under Queen Elizabeth I. She was the one who actually established the Church of England. And one of her close advisors was John Dee. And John Dee was a mathematician and a philosopher and an alchemist and an astronomer and an astrologer. And probably really good at conceptualizing futures and trying to imprint them on things. And Elizabeth I was known as the Virgin Queen, that she didn't marry and she didn't have any children. And so for me in this space, and again, this is the Cathedral of the Transfiguration, and it's open to light, it's open to nature. And when we got here yesterday, there were books of common prayer on the altar that one of them had ribbon bookmarks, and the first ribbon bookmark was for August 6th, which was the Transfiguration date, which they had a celebration because that's the date that this was opened in 1925, was August 6th. And even though we're a week later, it was still on that page. And then it was Psalm 33. And Psalm 33 was very much about the sanctity of the Creator and playing music, playing your song, your trumpets, and knowing that that is the strongest piece. Like, man can't overcome that. And, no matter how many armies you have or how many horses you have, like, the plan of God is above all of those things, and sort of be joyful in that. So maybe we can hold fast to the fact that, God and Mother Nature together have probably other plans for these transhuman, the human plus agenda. So, but the Virgin Queen, this idea of through biogeochemistry maybe catalyzing life outside of a female womb, creating this sort of Frankenstein chemical soup that would make some sort of life form, transforming life forms in their present state into something that is either digital or, chopped up in bits and parts and replaced and swap out presto changeo transformer stuff. And that feels like the backstory to this very quaint and lovely little chapel that again is on the grounds of these sacred springs, sacred to the indigenous people, and they're these iron springs. So I will stop on the way out at the big hotel and to show you one of the springs. But I feel almost like this preserve here of all of the cabins and this 1,000 acres, that maybe it is like anchoring the colonial interest into this sacred energetic space. And I don't know how that's going to work out. And actually, before I came down, when I was reading, because this actually is called the Bayse Vortex, the energy vortex, I read Tuck Everlasting, which was a children's book I read a long time ago by Natalie Babbitt, and it was talking about drinking water from the spring in this wood under an ash tree, and that it gave you eternal life, and that this farm family passing through had accidentally drunk from it, their 2 sons who were teenagers, and them and their horse, and then they lived forever. And sort of what a terrible thing that was to actually live forever, because you outlived all the people that you cared about and you loved, and you were looked at askance, and that was real trauma. And so I feel like all of these longevity studies and radical life extension and trying to reimagine what life actually is, that's part of the Berggruen work that I've been doing. That's all in this mix here. And I'm the cultural landscape gal, so I show up places. Like I said, I got this wonderful invitation, and my friend had no idea really even of sort of all the back history of this place. And it's quite special. It has a story to tell. It has these layers of history, and those stories have a relevance to today. The stories of disappearance of the original people, and the founding fathers sneaking over the line, and the sacred springs, and then the Anglicans, and there's a lot of lawyers, who have plaques here, and people who are official, like their goal is to get all of that on blockchain so that we can have peace. At least that's what the Quakers want. The Quakers and the Anglicans are always like that, but I don't know, maybe they could get together on blockchain peace programs. And all around us is nature, is this pine trees and oak trees and maple trees. And I got a lot of stuff on my trip, not a lot, but I got these are really great pine cones. I use these for my heart at the insane asylum. And so we'll move down, we'll take a quick look at the hotel and the spring, and then I will wrap up my day. Spring, just taking a quick look. The Orkney Spring. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow, in memory of Georgia Moore, 1861 and 1931. And you can see how incredibly orange the water is. It's quite something. I think this is the iron content. It's almost, it's almost like alive. It feels like. So this, when we talk about biogeochemistry and like creating life, cooking up some sort of soup, this is interesting. And this isn't the only mineral spring in the area. There are other ones that have been used for medicinal purposes, again, by the original people and through the 18th century Even the founding fathers would go to these springs. But yeah, Orkney Springs. In Bayse, Orkney Springs, the Bayse Vortex. All right, so this is the big hotel. You can kind of see this is just the side. It goes all the way back. It's huge. And then there are a lot of other buildings, outbuildings and things that go along with it. All right, there it is from the front. You can see how extensive it is. It goes all the way up. It is evidently, I think, the largest historic wooden building in the state of Virginia. So it's quite large. And then there's these other outbuildings here. There's like a whole little complex down on that side. And these are almost like little, I guess they're rental. You can rent them as regular people, but a lot of them do summer camps and also family reunions. All right, so we're walking up. This is a little structure that's built over the Bare Wallow Spring. And the day we were out, it was actually really soggy right around in the moss in the grass, but that seems to have, now it's just muddy. It's not actually actively percolating the water. But I put my hand in that little hole and I could see it. There's the Bare Wallow Spring and the spring itself. I think some kids are running up. So I'm just gonna show you real quick. Do you mind if I do this for a sec? Because I'm just videoing it. I don't see, you can see the water. Whoa, so there's some historic water, yeah. So anyway, there's a pond over there. All right, so I'm a hot, sticky mess, but it was a good day. And you can see there's a little pond behind me and some of the other outbuildings. It's quite a large complex. It has 2 large kitchens, and you can imagine that it would take quite a bit of resources to staff and maintain and keep everything up to date and really nice the way that is. So, you know, again, this is under the management of the Archdiocese of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Episcopal Archdiocese. And I find that very interesting, just the whole Church of England, Elizabeth I, Jamestown to today, and these sacred springs. Again, the Bare Wallow Spring. I had to go kind of quickly because there was a little boy who was really excited to come play with the water. But yeah, so this is my time in the Shenandoah. I'm heading home tomorrow by way of Baltimore. I'm going to try to make a few stops along the Beltway, and we'll see how much I get done. I'm always overly ambitious, but I was grateful to have this invitation to come out, have a bit of a change of scenery. I like to do site work, see what we come across. The Woodrow Wilson Library was a real surprise, and you know, the Walter Russell Museum was really interesting. I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about him and his downloads and sort of energetic scientific drawings and how that relates to him being networked at the highest levels with FDR. And yeah, the beautiful nature and the insane asylum. I mean, who doesn't want to go to an insane asylum, an abandoned one, and decorate it with hearts and read about the raving delusions of a pioneer X-ray crystallographer. Yeah, good times. So come hang with me, and you're always open to some strange tourism. So anyway, thanks for listening.